The crisp autumn air of London carried the scent of fallen leaves as former President Barack Obama stepped out of the black sedan that had transported him from Heathrow Airport. The cobblestones of the historic courtyard echoed with each measured step he took, his polished shoes creating a rhythmic percussion against the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of diplomatic meetings, royal ceremonies, and moments that shaped world history. Obama adjusted his navy blue suit jacket, a gesture that had become second nature during his 8 years in the Oval Office, and surveyed the magnificent architecture surrounding him. The Gothic spires reached toward the overcast sky like fingers grasping for something divine, while ornate windows reflected the muted light of the late afternoon sun. This wasn't his first visit to this particular royal residence, but something about today felt different, charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. His security detail moved with practiced precision around him, their eyes constantly scanning the perimeter while maintaining the careful balance between protection and allowing their charge the dignity of movement. Obama had grown accustomed to this dance over the years, understanding that their vigilance was what allowed him moments like these, opportunities to engage with the world beyond the protective bubble that had become his reality. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks prior, delivered through the proper diplomatic channels with all the formal language and ceremonial weight such communications required. Her Majesty requested the honor of his presence for a private audience, the letter had stated in elegant script. The purpose remained deliberately vague, as was customary for such royal engagements, but Obama's curiosity had been piqued immediately. During his presidency, his meetings with the Queen had always been marked by mutual respect and genuine warmth that transcended the formal protocols required by their respective positions. She had been a steady presence throughout his administration, offering subtle guidance during turbulent international moments and serving as a bridge between America and its oldest ally during times when diplomatic relationships required delicate navigation. As he approached the main entrance, Obama noticed the meticulous attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the royal household. The brass fixtures gleamed with fresh polish, every piece of stonework appeared to have been individually cleaned, and even the autumn flowers in the carefully manicured gardens seemed to have been arranged with mathematical precision. This level of preparation spoke to the significance the palace placed on today's meeting, though he still had no clear understanding of what awaited him inside. The massive oak doors swung open as he approached, revealing the familiar figure of the palace's chief steward. The elderly man's face bore the kind of dignity that came from decades of service to the crown, his movements economical and purposeful as he offered a precise bow that managed to convey both respect and welcome without appearing subservient. "Good afternoon, Mr. President," the steward said, his voice carrying the refined accent that Obama had come to associate with the highest levels of British society. "Her Majesty is looking forward to your arrival. If you would be so kind as to follow me, sir." The interior of the palace never failed to impress Obama, no matter how many times he had walked these corridors. Portraits of monarchs spanning centuries gazed down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow visitors as they passed. The carpet beneath his feet was so thick it seemed to absorb sound, creating an almost otherworldly silence that emphasized the weight of history contained within these walls. They passed through several antechambers, each more magnificent than the last, before arriving at a pair of doors that Obama recognized from previous visits. The steward paused, straightened his already perfect posture, and knocked with the precise rhythm that protocol demanded. "Enter," came the familiar voice from within, carrying the authority of 8 decades and a lifetime of leadership. The Queen sat in her customary chair near the window, the afternoon light creating a soft halo around her silver hair. Despite her advanced age, her posture remained regal, her eyes sharp with the intelligence that had guided her through the complexities of modern monarchy. She wore a simple but elegant blue dress, adorned with a single strand of pearls that caught the light as she moved. "Barack," she said, rising with the fluid grace that seemed to defy her years, "how wonderful to see you again." The use of his first name, while not unprecedented in their private meetings, still struck Obama as significant. Their relationship had evolved over the years from formal diplomatic courtesy to something approaching genuine friendship, though always within the carefully maintained boundaries that their respective positions required. "Your Majesty," Obama replied, offering the slight bow that protocol demanded while noting the genuine warmth in her smile. "Thank you for inviting me. It's always an honor." They settled into their chairs, positioned to facilitate conversation while maintaining the appropriate respect for royal protocol. Obama noticed that the Queen seemed more reflective than usual, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the window where the palace gardens stretched into the distance. "I've been thinking quite a lot lately about legacy," she began, her voice carrying a weight that immediately commanded his full attention. "About what we leave behind when our time in service comes to an end." Obama leaned forward slightly, recognizing the gravity in her tone. Throughout his political career, he had learned to read the subtle cues that often preceded moments of significant revelation, and something in the Queen's demeanor suggested that this conversation would prove more substantial than the pleasant diplomatic exchanges that typically characterized their meetings. "During my reign," she continued, "I've had the privilege of meeting with 12 American presidents. Each brought their own perspective, their own challenges, their own vision for the relationship between our nations. But, I must confess, Barack, that our conversations have always held a special place in my memory." The admission surprised him. While he had sensed a connection between them that transcended mere diplomatic necessity, hearing her acknowledge it directly was both humbling and intriguing. He waited, understanding that interrupting such a moment would be both inappropriate and counterproductive. "There's something I want to share with you today," the Queen said, her eyes meeting his directly. "Something that happened during your last official visit that I believe you should know about. It concerns one of my guards, a young man whose story I think will interest you greatly." Obama felt a stirring of curiosity mixed with anticipation. The Royal Guards were legendary for their stoicism and professionalism, trained to maintain their composure under any circumstances. What could possibly have occurred involving one of these elite protectors that would warrant such a carefully orchestrated revelation? "His name is James Whitfield," the Queen continued, settling back in her chair as if preparing for a longer narrative. 24 years old, from a small town in Yorkshire that most people couldn't find on a map. He joined the Guard service 3 years ago, following in his grandfather's footsteps." As she spoke, Obama found himself drawn into the story despite not yet understanding its significance. There was something in the Queen's tone that suggested deep personal investment in this young man's tale, a quality he had rarely heard in their previous conversations. "James grew up in circumstances that would be familiar to many of your constituents, Barack. His father worked in the coal mines until they closed, his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. They struggled, as so many families do, but they never lost their dignity or their belief that hard work and dedication could change their circumstances." The parallels to his own background and the stories of countless Americans he had met during his presidency were immediately apparent to Obama. He began to understand why the Queen felt this story might resonate with him, though he still couldn't grasp the full significance of what she was sharing. "James earned his position through merit alone," the Queen continued, pride evident in her voice. "Top marks in all his training, commendations for his dedication and professionalism. But, more than that, he possesses something that cannot be taught, a genuine understanding of service, of the honor that comes with protecting something larger than oneself." Obama nodded, thinking of the Secret Service agents who had protected him and his family, men and women whose dedication to duty often went unrecognized by the public they served. The weight of knowing that others were willing to risk everything for your safety was something that never became routine, no matter how long you lived with such protection. "During your last visit," the Queen said, pausing as if gathering her thoughts, "something extraordinary happened. Something that reminded me why I chose this life of service, and why the connections we make as leaders matter far more than the policies we implement or the speeches we deliver." The room seemed to grow quieter, if such a thing were possible, as if the very walls were leaning in to hear what would come next. Obama felt his pulse quicken slightly, the same sensation he had experienced before receiving news that would prove to be life-changing. "James was on duty in the corridor outside the reception hall where we were meeting with your delegation," the Queen began, her voice taking on a storytelling quality that drew Obama deeper into the moment. He had been standing at his post for nearly 4 hours, as is customary during such events, maintaining the perfect stillness and alertness that his position requires. Obama could visualize the scene clearly, having walked past countless such guards during his various visits to royal residences. Their ability to remain motionless for extended periods while maintaining complete awareness of their surroundings had always impressed him, representing a level of discipline and dedication that commanded respect. "What I'm about to tell you," the Queen said, leaning forward slightly, "was witnessed by several members of my staff, but the full significance of what occurred only became clear to me later, when I took the time to truly understand what had transpired." The anticipation in the room was palpable now, and Obama found himself holding his breath as he waited for the revelation that seemed poised to reshape his understanding of that previous visit. Whatever had happened, it was clear that it had affected the Queen profoundly, enough to warrant this special audience and the careful preparation that had obviously gone into this moment. As you were leaving that day, the Queen continued, walking down the corridor with your security detail, something happened that I have never witnessed in all my years of observing the interactions between world leaders and my guard staff. She paused, her gaze moving again toward the window, as if she were watching the memory play out in the gardens beyond. When she looked back at Obama, her eyes held an emotion he couldn't quite identify, something between wonder and deep satisfaction. James broke protocol, she said simply, the words hanging in the air between them like a revelation that required time to fully comprehend. Obama's eyebrows rose slightly. Breaking royal protocol was not something done lightly, particularly not by a member of the Guard whose entire career depended on strict adherence to established procedures. The implications of such an action could be severe, potentially ending a young man's career before it had truly begun. I can see you understand the gravity of what I'm saying, the Queen observed, noting his reaction. But what happened next is what makes this story truly extraordinary, and why I felt compelled to share it with you today. The late afternoon sun had begun to shift, casting longer shadows across the room and bathing everything in a golden light that seemed to emphasize the importance of the moment. Obama waited, understanding that the Queen was building towards something significant, something that required this careful pacing and attention to detail. Before I tell you exactly what James did and why, she said, I want you to understand something about the kind of young man he is. In his 3 years of service, he has never once been late, never missed a duty assignment, never received anything less than exemplary marks on his evaluations. His dedication to his role and to the institution he serves has been absolute. This context made the protocol breach even more intriguing. A guard with such a spotless record didn't simply decide to abandon procedure without compelling reason. Whatever had motivated James's actions must have been extraordinary indeed. The week before your visit, the Queen continued, James learned something about his family that changed his perspective on many things. His grandfather, whom he had idolized since childhood, had served not only as a royal guard but had also been involved in activities during World War II that James had never fully understood. Obama sensed that they were approaching the heart of the story, the crucial information that would explain why this particular moment had resonated so deeply with the Queen and why she felt it necessary to share it with him personally. James's grandfather had been part of the group that helped escort Jewish refugees to safety during the war, the Queen revealed. He had risked his career, his freedom, and potentially his life to help people he had never met simply because it was the right thing to do. The weight of this revelation began to settle over Obama as he started to understand the layers of meaning embedded in what the Queen was sharing. The connection between past and present, between service and sacrifice, between the formal requirements of duty and the higher calling of moral obligation was becoming clear. When James learned this about his grandfather, the Queen continued, he began to understand that true service sometimes requires courage that goes beyond following orders, that there are moments when doing the right thing matters more than maintaining the status quo. Obama found himself thinking about his own grandfather's service during the war, about the stories of ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. The parallels between James's discovery and his own understanding of family legacy were striking and deeply moving. On the day of your visit, the Queen said, her voice growing softer with apparent emotion, as you walked past James's post, something happened that I believe was inevitable once he understood who his grandfather truly was and what his legacy represented. The room seemed to hold its breath as the Queen prepared to reveal the moment that had clearly affected her so profoundly. Obama could sense that whatever she was about to share would not only explain the purpose of today's meeting but would also provide insight into the kind of connections that transcend political boundaries and cultural differences. James stepped forward, the Queen said, the words carrying the weight of their significance. For the first time in his career, he abandoned his post and approached you directly. The silence that followed the Queen's revelation stretched between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Obama felt his heart rate increase as he processed what she had just told him. A royal guard breaking protocol to approach him directly was unprecedented, the kind of action that could end careers and create international incidents if handled incorrectly. Yet something in the Queen's demeanor suggested that whatever had transpired had been handled with grace rather than punishment. Your security detail reacted as they were trained to do, the Queen continued, her voice carrying a note of understanding for the impossible position James's action had created. They immediately moved to intercept him, to protect you from what could have been perceived as a potential threat. But what happened next is what makes this story so remarkable. Obama leaned forward, completely absorbed in the narrative. He tried to recall that particular visit, searching his memory for any unusual incidents, but nothing came to mind. The fact that he had been unaware of such a significant breach spoke to the professionalism of both his security team and the palace staff in managing what could have been a disastrous situation. James raised his hands immediately, the Queen said, showing that he meant no harm. But, instead of backing down when confronted by your security team, he called out to you directly. He said, and I remember his exact words because they were reported to me within the hour, "Mr. President, please, I just need 30 seconds. My grandfather would never forgive me if I didn't speak to you." The emotion in the Queen's voice as she recounted these words was unmistakable. Obama could envision the scene, a young guard, trained for absolute discipline and silence, finding the courage to risk everything for a brief moment of connection. The mention of his grandfather added a layer of poignancy that made the guard's actions even more compelling. Your lead agent, a man whose name I believe is Thompson, was preparing to escort James away immediately, the Queen continued. But, you did something that surprised everyone present. You held up your hand and asked your security to wait. Obama felt a stirring of memory, a faint recollection of a moment when something had caused him to pause during what should have been a routine departure. The details remained frustratingly vague, but the emotional resonance of the Queen's words suggested that whatever had happened had been significant enough to leave an impression, even if the specifics had faded over time. You looked at James directly, the Queen said, and, despite the obvious tension of the situation, despite the breach of protocol and the security concerns, you asked him what he wanted to say. You gave him the 30 seconds he had requested. The character of this response aligned with Obama's own understanding of his leadership style. Throughout his presidency, he had made it a point to listen to unexpected voices, to find moments of genuine human connection even within the constraints of security protocols and official schedules. If such a moment had occurred, it would have been consistent with his approach to the office. James stood at attention, the Queen continued, as if he were delivering a report to his commanding officer, but his voice carried an emotion that was impossible to ignore. He told you that his grandfather had recently passed away, and that in going through his effects, the family had discovered a collection of letters and photographs that revealed his role in helping Jewish refugees during the war. Obama felt a chill of understanding. Stories of ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage during history's darkest moments always affected him deeply. The fact that this young guard had recently discovered such a legacy in his own family added profound meaning to his decision to break protocol. James told you, the Queen said, pausing as if to ensure that the full weight of his words would be properly conveyed, that his grandfather had written in his private journal about the importance of speaking truth to power, of finding moments to bridge the gaps between people who come from different worlds but share common values. The connection between the grandfather's wartime actions and the grandson's decision to approach Obama was becoming clear. Both had involved the courage to act beyond the comfortable boundaries of their expected roles, to reach across divides in pursuit of something greater than personal safety or career advancement. But what James said next, the Queen continued, her voice growing quieter with apparent emotion, is what moved everyone present, including your own security detail, in ways that none of us expected. Obama found himself holding his breath again, sensing that they were approaching the emotional core of the story, the moment that had prompted the Queen to arrange this private audience and share this carefully guarded memory. James told you that his grandfather's journal contained several entries about watching your campaign from across the ocean, about how seeing an African-American man ascend to the presidency of the United States had given him hope that the world his grandfather had fought to protect was actually becoming reality. The words hit Obama with unexpected force. During his presidency, he had been acutely aware of the symbolic weight his position carried, not just within America but around the world. Letters from international supporters had been a constant source of encouragement during difficult times, but hearing about this second-hand connection to a World War II veteran touched something deeper. James's grandfather had written, the Queen continued, that watching your inauguration had been one of the most powerful moments of his final years, that it represented the fulfillment of everything he had believed about human potential and the possibility of positive change. Obama felt his eyes beginning to moisten as he absorbed the full impact of these revelations. The idea that his presidency had provided comfort and inspiration to a man who had risked everything to save lives during humanity's darkest hour was both humbling and profoundly moving. But James wasn't finished, the Queen said, noting Obama's emotional response with gentle understanding. He told you that his grandfather had made him promise, shortly before his death, that if he ever had the opportunity to meet you in person, he should tell you something specific. The anticipation in the room was almost unbearable now. Obama could feel tears threatening to fall as he waited for the revelation that was clearly building to an emotional crescendo that would explain why the Queen had felt compelled to share this story in such detail. James told you, the Queen said, her own voice now thick with emotion, that his grandfather wanted you to know that your presidency had given meaning to his wartime sacrifices, that seeing you in the White House had convinced him that the world he had fought to preserve was capable of becoming everything he had dreamed it could be. The tears that Obama had been fighting finally began to fall. The connection between past and present, between sacrifice and hope, between one generation's courage and another's achievement was overwhelming in its beauty and significance. He understood now why the Queen had arranged this meeting, why she had felt this story needed to be shared in person rather than through any other means. But there was more, the Queen said gently, allowing Obama a moment to compose himself while continuing the narrative that had clearly moved her as deeply as it was affecting him. James told you that his grandfather had specifically requested that he express gratitude not just for your service as president, but for the example you had set about dignity and leadership. Obama wiped his eyes with the handkerchief the Queen had quietly provided, overwhelmed by the generosity of spirit that had connected him across time and space to a man he had never met but who had apparently found hope in his presidency during his final years. Your response to James, the Queen continued, was what convinced me that this story needed to be preserved and shared with you today. Despite the breach of protocol, despite the security concerns, despite the unusual nature of the entire encounter, you thanked James for his courage in sharing his grandfather's message. Obama was beginning to remember more details of the encounter now, triggered by the Queen's careful reconstruction of events. The image of a young guard standing at attention while delivering an emotionally charged message from his deceased grandfather was starting to emerge from the recesses of his memory. You told James, the Queen said, that his grandfather sounded like an extraordinary man, and that knowing his story and his message would stay with you for the rest of your life. You asked about his grandfather's name, and, when James told you it was William Whitfield, you repeated it back to him as if committing it to memory. The act of remembering and honoring the name of someone he had never met was characteristic of Obama's approach to such encounters, but hearing it recounted by the Queen gave it additional significance. Names mattered, stories mattered, and the connections between people across time and circumstance mattered most of all. But what happened then, the Queen said, building toward what was clearly the emotional climax of her story, surprised everyone present, including myself when it was reported to me later. Obama waited, sensing that whatever was coming would provide the final piece of understanding about why this encounter had remained so vivid in the Queen's memory and why she had felt compelled to share it with him in such detail. You asked James if you could shake his hand, the Queen said, not as a former president meeting a guard, but as one man honoring another man's grandfather and the legacy he had left behind. The simple humanity of this gesture, conducted in front of security personnel and palace staff who were witnessing an unprecedented breach of protocol, spoke to the kind of moment that transcended all the formal structures and expectations that normally govern such encounters. James was so overwhelmed by your request, the Queen continued, that he had to steady himself against the wall behind him. Several of my staff members who witnessed the exchange later told me they had never seen anything quite like it, the spontaneous breaking down of barriers between people who were supposed to maintain specific roles and distances. Obama could feel the weight of the moment as the Queen described it, understanding now why it had resonated so deeply with everyone present. In a world where public figures and their protectors were required to maintain careful boundaries, moments of genuine human connection were rare and precious. When you shook James's hand, the Queen said, you told him that his grandfather would be proud of him for having the courage to speak when it mattered, for honoring his grandfather's memory by sharing his story with someone who needed to hear it. The circle of connection was becoming complete now, from grandfather to grandson, from wartime sacrifice to presidential service, from private hope to public acknowledgement. Obama understood why the Queen had wanted him to know the full story, why she had felt it important enough to warrant this special meeting. But, the most remarkable part of the entire encounter, the Queen said, was what James said as you were leaving. He told you that meeting you had been the honor of his life, but, more than that, it had helped him understand what his grandfather had been trying to teach him about service and sacrifice. Obama felt another wave of emotion as he realized that the encounter had been as meaningful for James as it had been for him, that the young guard had found something in their brief exchange that connected him more deeply to his grandfather's legacy and his own sense of purpose. James told you, the Queen continued, that he finally understood why his grandfather had written in his journal that true leadership wasn't about power or position, but about the willingness to see and honor the humanity in everyone you encounter. The profundity of this insight, delivered by a young guard who had risked his career to share his grandfather's story, crystallized everything that Obama had tried to embody during his years in public service. The fact that it had come through such an unexpected channel made it even more meaningful. After you left that day, the Queen said, James returned to his post, but something fundamental had changed. My staff reported that he seemed to carry himself differently, with a confidence and sense of purpose that went beyond mere professional competence. The transformation of a young man through a moment of courageous connection was precisely the kind of outcome that Obama had hoped his presidency might inspire, but hearing about it in such specific detail was extraordinarily moving. I promoted James 3 months later, the Queen revealed, not because of his breach of protocol, but because of what that breach revealed about his character and his understanding of what true service means. Obama smiled through his tears, understanding that the Queen's decision had validated James's courage while also recognizing the deeper qualities that his actions had revealed. But, there's something else, the Queen said, indicating that the story was not yet complete. Something that I believe will interest you even more than what I've already shared. The revelation that there was more to James's story sent a fresh surge of anticipation through Obama. He had already been deeply moved by what the Queen had shared, but her suggestion that additional layers remained to be unveiled promised even greater emotional depth. He settled back in his chair, preparing himself for whatever revelations were yet to come. After our encounter, the Queen began, James began researching his grandfather's wartime service more thoroughly. The family had only discovered the journals and photographs recently, and much of William Whitfield's story remained hidden in archives that required significant effort to access. Obama nodded, understanding the way such family histories often emerged in fragments, requiring dedicated investigation to piece together the full scope of someone's contributions and sacrifices. The fact that James had felt compelled to continue this research spoke to the profound impact their brief meeting had made on him. What James discovered, the Queen continued, exceeded anything his family had previously known about his grandfather's activities during the war. The initial documents they had found represented only a small portion of William's involvement in the resistance network that helped Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution. The scope of this revelation began to dawn on Obama. If William Whitfield's role had been more extensive than initially understood, it meant that James's decision to approach him had been inspired by an even more significant legacy than either of them had realized during their brief encounter. Through his research at the Imperial War Museum and the National Archives, the Queen explained, James learned that his grandfather had been part of a coordinated effort that saved over 300 lives during the course of the war. The operation involved significant personal risk and required him to use his position as a royal guard to facilitate communications and safe passage. Obama felt his breath catch as he absorbed the magnitude of William's wartime heroism. 300 lives represented hundreds of families, thousands of descendants who owed their existence to the courage of a young man willing to risk everything for people he would never meet. But, what made James's discoveries even more remarkable, the Queen said, leaning forward with obvious pride in the young man's dedication, was what he learned about his grandfather's motivations for these actions. Obama waited, sensing that this additional layer would provide crucial context for understanding both William's wartime choices and James's decision to break protocol to honor his grandfather's memory. William had kept detailed records, the Queen explained, not just of the operations themselves, but of his thoughts and feelings about what he was doing and why. James found letters that his grandfather had written but never sent, journal entries that revealed the philosophical foundation for his actions. The existence of such detailed personal documentation suggested a man who had understood the historical significance of his actions and had wanted to preserve not just the facts of what he had done, but the reasoning behind his choices. In one particular journal entry, the Queen said, William wrote about his belief that service to the crown meant more than following orders or maintaining tradition. He believed that true loyalty required defending the values that the crown represented: justice, protection of the innocent, and the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. Obama recognized immediately the parallel between William's wartime philosophy and James's decision to break protocol. Both men had understood that genuine service sometimes required going beyond the letter of their duties to honor the spirit of what they had sworn to protect. William wrote, the Queen continued, that he hoped future generations would understand that being a guardian meant more than standing at attention and following procedures. He hoped that those who came after him would have the wisdom to recognize moments when human decency demanded action, even if that action challenged established norms. The prescient nature of William's hopes made James's actions even more poignant. Without knowing about these specific writings, James had instinctively followed the path his grandfather had envisioned, proving that values and principles could be transmitted across generations even without explicit instruction. But the most significant discovery James made, the Queen said, her voice carrying a weight that suggested they were approaching the emotional core of her revelations, was a collection of letters that William had received from some of the families he had helped save. Obama leaned forward, understanding that these letters would provide first-hand testimony to William's impact and would likely contain emotional content that would deepen the significance of everything he had already heard. The letters span several decades, the Queen explained, from immediately after the war through the 1990s, just a few years before William's death. They tell the story not just of lives saved, but of entire family lines that exist because of his courage. The long-term perspective offered by these letters would have provided James with a profound understanding of his grandfather's lasting impact, showing him how a few years of dangerous service had rippled forward through time to touch countless lives. One letter in particular, the Queen said, moved James so deeply that he brought it to my attention personally. It was written by a woman named Sarah Goldman in 1992, nearly 50 years after William had helped her family escape. Obama felt his pulse quicken as he sensed that this specific letter would provide crucial insight into why James had felt compelled to approach him and why the Queen considered their encounter so significant. Sarah wrote to thank William not just for saving her family's lives, the Queen continued, but for teaching her something about courage that had shaped the way she raised her own children and grandchildren. The intergenerational impact of William's actions was becoming clear. His wartime heroism had influenced not just the immediate survival of refugee families, but had served as a model of moral courage that was passed down through multiple generations. In her letter, the Queen said, Sarah described how her family had regularly discussed William's actions during family gatherings, how his example had inspired her children to pursue careers in public service and social justice. Obama began to understand how William's story connected to larger themes of leadership and service that had relevance far beyond his specific wartime actions. The ripple effects of individual courage could inspire others to make their own contributions to justice and human dignity. But what made this letter particularly significant for James, the Queen continued, was Sarah's description of how William had explained his actions to her father during one of their brief encounters during the evacuation process. Obama sensed that this recounted conversation would provide direct insight into William's thinking and would help explain why James had felt such a strong connection between his grandfather's values and Obama's presidency. According to Sarah's letter, the Queen said, William told her father that he believed history would judge people not by how well they followed orders, but by whether they had the courage to act when they witnessed injustice, even if that action came at personal cost. The philosophical foundation for William's choices was becoming clear, and Obama could see how James had recognized similar principles in Obama's approach to leadership and his willingness to address difficult issues even when it was politically challenging. William told Sarah's father, the Queen continued, that he hoped future generations would produce leaders who understood that true power came from the willingness to use position and influence to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Obama felt a deep emotional resonance with these words, recognizing in them the same principles that had guided his own approach to public service. The connection between William's wartime philosophy and Obama's presidential priorities was becoming clear. But the most powerful part of Sarah's letter, the Queen said, was her description of a conversation she had overheard between William and her mother during their final meeting before the family's successful escape. Obama prepared himself for what he sensed would be the emotional climax of this particular revelation, understanding that this final piece of William's story would tie together all the threads the Queen had been weaving. William told Sarah's mother, the Queen said, her voice growing softer with emotion, that he believed the world would eventually produce a generation of leaders who looked different from traditional expectations but who embodied the same commitment to justice and human dignity that motivated his wartime actions. The connection to Obama's historic presidency was unmistakable now, and he began to understand why James had felt such a powerful need to share his grandfather's story. William had essentially prophesied the kind of leadership that Obama represented. Sarah wrote that her mother had asked William how he could be so certain about this future, the Queen continued, and William had replied that evil might triumph for periods of time, but that goodness and justice had a way of eventually finding expression through unexpected people in unexpected ways. Obama felt tears returning as he absorbed the profound faith in human potential that William had maintained even in the face of humanity's darkest impulses. The idea that his presidency had somehow validated that faith was both humbling and deeply moving. When James read this letter, the Queen said, he finally understood why seeing your inauguration had meant so much to his grandfather. In you, William had seen the fulfillment of his wartime belief that justice would eventually find a way to triumph. The complete circle of connection was now evident, from William's wartime courage to his faith in future leaders, from James's discovery of his grandfather's legacy to his decision to honor it by approaching Obama, from Obama's presidency as a symbol of progress to this moment of recognition and remembrance. James told me, the Queen continued, that reading Sarah's letter had convinced him that his grandfather's story needed to be shared with you personally, that you deserved to know about the hope your presidency had provided to a man who had risked everything to defend the values you embodied. Obama wiped away tears, overwhelmed by the weight of this connection across